My name is Sophie, and I never imagined that my mother-in-law Marguerite's birthday would mark the beginning of a nightmare that would turn my life upside down. That day, my husband, Pierre, gave me an ultimatum that shattered everything I thought I knew about our marriage. The day had started well. I'd gotten up early to bake a birthday cake for Marguerite, even though we'd never really had a warm relationship. Pierre seemed in good spirits, even helping me decorate the dining room for the little party we'd planned. "Are you sure you don't want me to invite a few of Mom's friends?" he asked as I laid out the place settings on the table. "No, I think it's better as a family," I replied, trying to keep my cool. The idea of spending a whole evening with Marguerite's snobbish friends was already giving me a headache. Marguerite arrived at around 7 p.m., decked out in her finest jewels as usual. Her heady perfume invaded the apartment as soon as she crossed the threshold. "Happy birthday, Mom," Pierre said, kissing her on both cheeks. "Thank you, darling," she replied before giving me a cold look. "Sophie." I forced a smile. "Happy birthday, Marguerite. I hope you enjoy the dinner I've prepared." The meal unfolded in a strange atmosphere. Pierre and Marguerite exchanged knowing glances that made me feel uncomfortable. I tried several times to initiate conversation, but my attempts were met with monosyllabic responses. It was at dessert time that everything changed. Pierre put down his fork and stared at me gravely. "Sophie, we need to talk." My heart clenched. "What is it?" "Mom and I have been talking, and we think it's time for you to show more dedication to our family." I frowned, not understanding what he was getting at. "What do you mean?" That's when Marguerite intervened, her sweet tone chilling my blood. "My dear, you know I've always dreamed of living in an apartment like yours. View of the Eiffel Tower, near the Champs-Élysées. It's a real gem." I felt panic rise in me. "Yes, it's true. But this is our apartment, Pierre's and mine." Pierre shook his head. "No, Sophie. This is your apartment. The one you inherited from your parents." The silence that followed was deafening. I looked at Pierre and Marguerite in turn, searching their eyes for an explanation. What I saw there chilled me, determination and a hint of cruelty I'd never noticed before. "What are you trying to tell me?" I asked, my voice trembling. Pierre took a deep breath. "Here's what's going to happen, Sophie. You're going to sign the apartment over to my mother. And from now on, you will serve her like a slave. If you refuse, I'll divorce you." I thought I was going to faint. Pierre's words echoed in my head like an infernal echo. I looked at Marguerite, who wore a satisfied smile. You're joking, aren't you?" I stammered. "Not at all, my dear," Marguerite replied. "It's time you learned your place in this family." I felt tears welling up in my eyes. "Pierre, how can you do this to me? We've been married for 5 years. He shrugged with an indifference that broke my heart. "Things change, Sophie. Take it or leave it." I stood up abruptly, knocking my chair over. "You two are crazy. I can't believe what I'm hearing." "Think it over, Sophie," Pierre said menacingly. "You have until tomorrow to make your decision. The apartment and your total devotion, or the divorce." I stormed out of the dining room, taking refuge in our bedroom. I slammed the door and collapsed on the bed, shaking with sobs. How had it come to this? What had I done to deserve such treatment? The next few hours were a whirlwind of emotions. I alternated between anger, grief, and disbelief. I thought back to all the happy moments Pierre and I had shared. Our meeting at university, our first kiss in the rain outside the Louvre, his proposal of marriage on a bateau mouche. Had it all been a lie? I spent a sleepless night, turning the problem over and over in my mind. I couldn't believe that the man I loved, the man who had sworn eternal fidelity and love to me, could betray me like that. And Marguerite. I knew she'd never really accepted me, but how could she want to enslave me and steal my most precious possession? By morning, I was exhausted but determined. I couldn't give in to this despicable blackmail. This apartment was all I had left of my parents, who had died in a car accident a few years earlier. It was my refuge, my haven. I couldn't abandon it, and certainly not to a woman who openly despised me. When Pierre entered the room, I looked him straight in the eye. "My decision is made," I said in a firm voice. He arched an eyebrow. And I refuse. I won't give up my apartment to your mother, and I won't be anyone's slave. His face hardened. You know what this means, don't you? I nodded, my heart heavy but resolute. Yes. The divorce. Very well, he said coldly. You asked for it. I'll contact my lawyer today. As he left the room, I felt a mixture of relief and terror wash over me. I'd just put an end to my marriage, but I also felt I'd avoided the worst. What Pierre and Marguerite didn't know was that their ultimatum had awakened a strength in me I'd never known existed. I was determined to understand how my husband could have changed so much, and above all, to find out what was really behind this absurd demand. As I began to gather my things, a thought crossed my mind. What if this was just the tip of the iceberg? What else were Pierre and his mother hiding from me? What should have been a simple family reunion had turned into a nightmare. But it was only the beginning of a story that would turn out to be far more complex and darker than I could have imagined at the time. The days following Pierre's ultimatum were a whirlwind of emotions and discoveries. I was determined to understand how my husband, the man I'd loved for years, could have changed so radically. This quest for the truth led me down a path I'd never imagined. It all began the day after that terrible birthday party. Pierre had left early, claiming to have an important appointment at the office. I took advantage of his absence to begin my discreet investigations. My instincts told me something was wrong, and I was determined to find out what. My first step was to rummage through his home office. I felt guilty about invading her privacy, but I kept telling myself that I had a right to know what was really going on. At first, I found nothing unusual. Bills, bank statements, nothing out of the ordinary. But when I opened the last drawer of his desk, I found a small black notebook I'd never seen before. With trembling hands, I opened the notebook. Inside, I found a series of cryptic notes and numbers that meant nothing to me at first glance. However, one date jumped out at me. It was 3 months earlier, and next to it was scribbled Rencontre M, Plan en Marche. My heart sank. M could only be Marguerite, my mother-in-law. But what was the plan? And why so much mystery? Determined to find out more, I decided to investigate further. I turned on Pierre's computer, hoping he hadn't changed his password. Luckily, he was still using the date of our wedding. A wave of sadness washed over me as I realized that this happy memory was now tinged with bitterness. Once I was connected, I started going through her emails. At first, I didn't find anything unusual, but going back a few months, I discovered a hidden folder entitled Operation Legacy. With my heart pounding, I clicked on it. What I read made my blood run cold. Dozens of emails exchanged between Pierre and Marguerite, dating back several months, detailed a Machiavellian plan to take over my apartment and a large part of my possessions. In one of the first emails, Marguerite wrote, "My dear Pierre, I've thought long and hard about our situation. Sophie will never be the daughter-in-law I want her to be. Her inheritance, on the other hand, could be very useful to us. Here's what I propose." The plan was meticulously detailed. They planned to push me over the edge, make me doubt my sanity, and finally force me to sign over my property to them under the threat of an expensive, messy divorce. I read on, with tears in my eyes and a heavy heart. Each email revealed a new facet of their twisted plan. They had even considered committing me if I resisted their demands for too long. One email in particular made me shudder. "Pierre, don't forget that we have a lot to lose if Sophie finds out anything. Make sure you erase all traces of our communications. If necessary, we can always claim that she's emotionally unstable. I've already spoken to a few of our friends who will be willing to testify to this." Mom, the betrayal was total. Not only were they plotting to steal from me, they were willing to destroy my reputation and sanity to achieve their ends. As I was digesting this shocking information, I heard the front door open. Pierre was back. In a state of panic, I quickly closed all emails and turned off the computer. I barely had time to recompose myself when he entered the office. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his tone a mix of suspicion and irritation. I took a deep breath, trying to control the tremor in my voice. "I was just looking for a pen. I'm going to start packing." He looked at me for a moment, as if trying to read me. Then he nodded. "Good. The sooner it's done, the better. As soon as he left the room, I let out a sigh of relief. My heart was beating so fast I felt as if he could hear it on the other side of the door. The next few days were hell. I had to pretend that everything was fine, that I accepted the situation, all the while knowing what Pierre and Marguerite were plotting behind my back. Every time Pierre spoke to me, every time Marguerite came to the apartment to help me pack, I had to suppress the urge to shout at them, to tell them I knew everything. But I knew I had to be careful. They were months ahead of me, and I didn't know how far they were willing to go to carry out their plan. One evening, while I was pretending to be sorting out my things in our bedroom, I heard Pierre on the phone in the living room. He was speaking in a low voice, but I was able to catch a few snatches of conversation. Yes, Mom. No, she doesn't suspect anything. Yes, I'll take care of the papers. Don't worry, everything will be settled soon. This conversation reinforced my decision to keep my mouth shut. I had to keep on playing the game until I could find a solution. That's when I decided to discreetly contact a lawyer. I needed professional advice to navigate this complex situation. I chose a reputable firm, far from our neighborhood to avoid any risk of being seen. At my appointment with Maître Dubois, a lawyer specializing in family law, I spilled the beans. The emails, the plan, the ultimatum, everything. She listened attentively, taking notes and nodding from time to time. Madame la Maire, she said once I'd finished telling my story, what you're describing here is very serious. It is clearly an attempt at manipulation and extortion. We have enough to build a strong case against your husband and mother-in-law. His words both relieved and frightened me. On the one hand, I was reassured to know that the law was on my side. On the other, the idea of starting legal proceedings against the man I'd loved for so many years broke my heart. What do you advise me to do? I asked, my throat tight. For now, continue to act normally. Don't let them know you know about their plan. In the meantime, we'll gather all the evidence we can. The emails you found are an excellent starting point, but we'll need more. Following Maître Dubois' advice, I began meticulously documenting everything that happened at home. Every conversation, every suspicious gesture, everything was noted in a diary that I kept carefully hidden. One evening, while I was pretending to be asleep, I heard Pierre on the phone in the bathroom. Yes, Mom, everything's going according to plan. No, she hasn't noticed a thing. The papers will be ready next week. Yes, I know it's risky, but it's our only chance of getting this apartment. Don't worry, I've got it under control. This conversation confirmed my worst fears. Not only was their plan still in motion, but they were preparing to take action very soon. The next day, I made a risky but necessary decision. Taking advantage of a moment when Pierre was in the shower, I quickly copied all the compromising emails onto a USB stick I'd bought especially for the occasion. It was risky, but I knew the evidence would be crucial to my defense. As the days passed, I felt the noose tightening around me. Pierre became more and more insistent, asking me when I was going to sign the papers to sell the apartment. As for Marguerite, she came by more and more often, already measuring the rooms for her future furniture. Every day was an ordeal. I had to play a role, pretending that I was about to give in to their demands, all the while knowing that I was preparing my counterattack. The tension was palpable, and I constantly feared that Pierre or Marguerite would discover that I knew everything. But in the midst of this nightmare, one thing was clear: I wasn't going to let it happen. I was determined to fight, not only for my apartment, but also for my dignity and my future. What Pierre and Marguerite didn't know was that their Machiavellian plan had awakened in me a strength and determination I didn't know I had. As I lay in bed that night, listening to Pierre's steady breathing beside me, I knew the battle was just beginning. I was ready to do anything to thwart their plan and regain control of my life. What they had taken for weakness would turn out to be my greatest strength. Armed with the knowledge of the plot hatched against me, I decided it was time to go on the offensive. I could no longer content myself with being a mere spectator to my own life. It was time to devise a meticulous counterattack plan, one that would not only allow me to keep my apartment, but also unmask Pierre and Marguerite once and for all. My first step was to keep playing the game. I had to make them believe that I was about to give in to their demands. One morning, as we were having breakfast, I plucked up my courage and said to Pierre, "I've been doing a lot of thinking over the last few days. I think I'm ready to discuss the terms of transferring the apartment to your mother." Pierre's face lit up with a smile I now found repulsive. "That's an excellent decision, Sophie. You'll see, everything will be fine." I nodded, feigning resignation. "I suppose so. Could we discuss it tonight with your mother?" "Of course, I'll call her right away to arrange it." While he made his call, I discreetly sent a message to Maître Dubois to inform him of the situation and ask for his advice on the next steps to take. That evening, Marguerite arrived, decked out in her finest finery as if she'd already taken possession of the premises. Her heady perfume invaded the apartment as soon as she crossed the threshold. "My dear Sophie," she mewed, kissing me on the cheeks, "I'm so glad you've finally seen reason." I suppressed a shudder of disgust and forced a smile. "I think that's best for everyone, don't you?" Pierre pulled a sheaf of papers from his briefcase. "I've already prepared all the necessary papers. All you have to do is sign them, Sophie, and everything will be settled." I took the documents, pretending to examine them carefully. "I see. But before I sign anything, I'd like to have them checked by a lawyer. You understand, this is an important decision, and I want to make sure everything's in order." I saw a flash of panic cross Pierre's eyes. "A lawyer? But come on, there's no need. It's all perfectly legal, I assure you." Marguerite intervened, her sweet voice barely concealing her irritation. "My dear, we're a family. Bringing in lawyers might complicate things unnecessarily." I looked innocent. "Oh, but I don't want to complicate anything. It's just a precaution. After all, as you say, we're a family. There's nothing to fear, is there?" Pierre and Marguerite exchanged a nervous glance. Finally, Pierre nodded. "Sure, if it'll make you feel better. Take all the time you need." This small victory gave me the courage to go ahead with my plan. The next day, I met with Maître Dubois to show her the documents. She examined them carefully, frowning several times. "As I feared," she said, putting the papers down again, "these documents are drafted in such a way as to strip you completely. Not only would you be giving up the apartment, but you'd also be giving up a large portion of your rights in the divorce." I nodded, not really surprised. "What do you advise me to do now?" "We'll continue to gather evidence. In the meantime, tell them you need more time to think. This will give us a chance to prepare our counterattack." Following his advice, I told Pierre that I needed a few more days to make my final decision. He seemed upset, but didn't insist, probably for fear of arousing my suspicions. Meanwhile, I intensified my research. I spent hours poring over Pierre's bank statements, looking for the slightest suspicious transaction. And that's when I made a startling discovery: large sums were regularly being paid into an offshore account in the name of a shell company. Intrigued, I decided to dig deeper. I hired a private detective, on the advice of Maître Dubois, to investigate Pierre's professional activities. What the detective discovered exceeded my worst fears. It turned out that Pierre, far from being the respectable businessman he claimed to be, was involved in a vast network of tax fraud and money laundering. The funds passing through the offshore account had come from these illegal activities. The discovery was a shock, but also an opportunity. I now had in my hands information that could not only protect me, but also bring down Pierre and his criminal network. Armed with this new evidence, I met again with Maître Dubois. We spent hours strategizing how to use this information to my advantage. "Here's what we're going to do," explained Maître Dubois. "We're going to prepare a complete dossier with all the evidence we've gathered, the compromising emails, the fraudulent documents they wanted you to sign, and evidence of your husband's illegal activities. Then we'll arrange a meeting with Pierre and Marguerite, in the presence of their lawyers." I nodded, feeling a mixture of apprehension and excitement rise within me. "And what will happen at this meeting?" "We'll present them with the evidence we have against them. We'll make them understand that if they persist in their plan, we won't hesitate to reveal everything to the authorities. That should be enough to make them back off." The plan was audacious, but it was my best chance of getting away with it. The next few days were spent in meticulous preparation for this confrontation. Every document was carefully checked, every piece of evidence meticulously organized. Meanwhile, I had to carry on acting at home. Pierre became increasingly impatient, urging me to sign documents. Marguerite came by almost every day, bringing fabric samples for the curtains or discussing the layout of the furniture as if she already owned the apartment. Every time I saw them plotting, every time I heard their whispers stop abruptly as I approached, I had to suppress the urge to throw it all back in their faces. But I knew I had to stand my ground. The moment of confrontation was approaching. Finally, the big day arrived. I pretended to have an appointment with the notary to sign the papers, and asked Pierre and Marguerite to accompany me. In reality, we were on our way to the offices of Maître Dubois. When we arrived and they realized where we were, I saw panic set in on their faces. "What does this mean?" asked Pierre, his voice betraying his nervousness. I took a deep breath. "That means the game is over, Pierre. I know everything." We entered the conference room where Maître Dubois was waiting for us, accompanied by 2 other lawyers. Pierre and Marguerite sat down, visibly uncomfortable. Maître Dubois took the floor. "Monsieur le Maire, Madame le Maire, we have summoned you today to discuss a very serious matter. We have in our possession evidence of your plot to strip Madame Sophie Le Maire of her property, as well as evidence of illegal activities carried out by Monsieur Pierre Le Maire." She began to present the evidence one by one, the emails exchanged between Pierre and Marguerite detailing their plan, the fraudulent documents they wanted me to sign, the bank statements showing the transfers to the offshore account. As the presentation progressed, I could see Pierre's face decompose. Marguerite, for her part, turned livid. These are lies," stammered Pierre. "You have no right to access this information." Maître Dubois smiled coldly. "On the contrary, Monsieur le Maire, everything has been obtained in a perfectly legal manner. And I can assure you that the authorities will be very interested in this information if we decide to pass it on to them." It was then that I spoke up. My voice trembled slightly, but I was determined. "Pierre, Marguerite, I leave you with a choice. Either you immediately relinquish all claim to my apartment and possessions, or we'll pass this matter on to the proper authorities. It's up to you." The silence that followed was deafening. Pierre and Marguerite looked at each other in panic. Finally, it was Marguerite who cracked first. "All right," she shouted. "Keep your damned apartment. We don't want it anymore." Pierre nodded, defeated. "What do you want us to do?" Maître Dubois pulled out a new document. "Here is an agreement which stipulates that you renounce all claims to Madame Sophie Le Maire's property. Furthermore, you agree to pay her substantial compensation for the moral prejudice she has suffered. If you sign this agreement, we undertake not to pass on any information concerning your illegal activities to the authorities." Pierre and Marguerite signed the document without even reading it, too eager to get it over with. Once they had signed, I felt a huge weight lift from my shoulders. It was over. I'd won. As I left the office, I took one last look at Pierre. The man I'd loved, the man I thought I knew, was gone. In his place stood a stranger, a man broken by his own greed. "Goodbye, Pierre," I said simply before turning on my heels and heading off to my new life. The experience had changed me forever. I had discovered a strength and determination in myself that I never knew existed. I had faced betrayal and emerged stronger. Now I knew I could overcome any obstacle. As I made my way home to the apartment that had remained mine, I felt both exhausted and exhilarated. The nightmare was over, but a new adventure was beginning. An adventure in which I would be mistress of my destiny, strengthened by the lesson life had just taught me. The fateful day had finally arrived. After weeks of meticulous preparation, I was ready to confront Pierre and Marguerite once and for all. My heart was pounding as I made my way to Maître Dubois' offices, where the meeting was to take place. I had pretended to have an appointment with the notary to sign the papers transferring the apartment, and Pierre and Marguerite were accompanying me, a look of ill-concealed triumph on their faces. They thought their victory was assured, completely unaware of what lay ahead. Arriving in front of the imposition of offices, I took a deep breath to calm my nerves. "This is it," I said in what I hoped was a firm voice. Pierre frowned as he recognized the address. "But this isn't the notary's office." "No, indeed," I replied, guiding them toward the entrance. We have a different kind of appointment today. Worry began to paint itself on their faces as we rode up in the elevator. Marguerite tried to keep her composure, but I could see her hands trembling slightly. When we entered the conference room, Maître Dubois was waiting for us, accompanied by 2 other lawyers and a man I recognized as the police inspector I'd been in contact with over the last few weeks. "What does this mean?" asked Pierre, his voice betraying his nervousness. I took a deep breath before replying, "It means, Pierre, that your little game is over. I know everything." Pierre's face turned livid, while Marguerite collapsed into a chair, visibly shocked. Maître Dubois spoke up, "Monsieur and Madame Lemaire, we have summoned you today to discuss an extremely serious matter. We have in our possession irrefutable evidence of your plot to strip Madame Sophie Lemaire of her property, as well as evidence of illegal activities carried out by Monsieur Pierre Lemaire." She then began to methodically present the evidence we had gathered. The emails exchanged between Pierre and Marguerite detailing their Machiavellian plan were projected onto a large screen. The fraudulent documents they wanted me to sign were distributed. Bank statements showing transfers to the offshore account were analyzed in detail. With each new revelation, I saw Pierre and Marguerite sink a little deeper into their seats. Their initial confidence had completely evaporated, replaced by palpable fear. It's all lies," finally stammered Pierre, in a desperate attempt to defend himself. "You have no right to access this information." Maître Dubois smiled coldly. "On the contrary, Monsieur Lemaire. Everything was obtained perfectly legally, and I can assure you that the authorities are very interested in this information." It was at this point that the police inspector intervened. "Mr. Lemaire, we have been investigating a vast tax fraud and money laundering network for several months. The information provided by your wife has been invaluable to our investigation." Pierre's face went pale. He glanced in panic at his mother, who seemed on the verge of fainting. Then I spoke up, my voice more assured than I would have thought possible. "Pierre, Marguerite, I'm giving you one last chance. Abandon all claims to my apartment and possessions immediately, cooperate fully with the authorities, and perhaps you can be granted some clemency." The silence that followed was deafening. Pierre and Marguerite looked at each other, completely lost. In the end, it was Marguerite who cracked first. "Very well," she cried, tears of rage running down her cheeks. "Keep your damned apartment. We don't want it anymore." Pierre, realizing all was lost, bowed his head in defeat. "What do you want us to do?" he whispered in a broken voice. Maître Dubois then pulled out a new document. "Here is an agreement which states that you renounce all claims to the property of Madame Sophie Lemaire. Furthermore, you agree to cooperate fully with the authorities in their investigation of your illegal activities. If you sign this agreement and abide by its terms, it could work in your favor at trial." Pierre and Marguerite signed the document without even bothering to read it, too eager to get the humiliation over with. Once the signatures were affixed, I felt a huge weight lift from my shoulders. It was all over. Not only had I saved my apartment, but I'd also unmasked their plot and illegal activities. The police inspector then approached Pierre. "Mr. Lemaire, you are under arrest for tax fraud, money laundering and attempted extortion. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can be used against you in a court of law." As Pierre was handcuffed and led away, Marguerite broke down sobbing. I looked at her, feeling only a mixture of pity and disgust. "How could you, Marguerite? How could you plot so against your own daughter-in-law?" Between sobs, she looked up at me. "You don't understand. We were in debt. We thought it was our only solution." I shook my head in disbelief. "There are always alternatives to betraying one's family, Marguerite. I hope you'll have time to reflect on your actions." While Marguerite was also being taken in for questioning, I found myself alone in the conference room with Maître Dubois. The adrenaline was starting to wear off, and I suddenly felt exhausted. "You've been remarkable, Sophie," Maître Dubois told me, placing a comforting hand on my shoulder. "Few people would have had the courage and determination to fight such a battle." I nodded, still reeling from the events. "I can't believe it's finally over. What's going to happen now?" "Pierre will face some very serious charges. The trial will probably take several months. As for Marguerite, She will probably be charged with complicity. Your testimony will be crucial to the prosecution. I nodded, realizing that even though the confrontation was over, I still had a long road ahead of me. What about the apartment? Maître Dubois smiled at me. It's entirely yours, without any possible dispute. In addition, you will be entitled to substantial damages for the moral prejudice suffered. As I left the office, I took a deep breath. The fresh air seemed sweeter than ever. I looked around, seeing the city with new eyes. I was free, truly free for the first time in months. On the way back to my apartment, really mine now, I thought about everything that had happened. Pierre's betrayal, Marguerite's greed, my own transformation from frightened woman to determined fighter. Arriving home, I walked around the apartment, touching the walls, the furniture, as if to reclaim the space. Every object seemed to have a new meaning, every room exuded victory. I sat down on the sofa, the same one where Pierre had given me his ultimatum weeks before. The tears began to flow, tears of relief, of sadness for what I'd lost, but also of pride for what I'd accomplished. The phone rang, pulling me out of my thoughts. It was my best friend, Claire. Sophie. I saw the news. Is it true? Pierre's been arrested? I took a deep breath. Yes, you did. It's a long story, Claire. Do you have time for a coffee? I'll be right there, she replied without hesitation. As I waited for Claire, I realized that this ordeal, as difficult as it had been, had also brought me unexpected gifts. I had discovered my inner strength, learned to fight for what was right, and realized the importance of friendship and support in difficult times. The sound of the doorbell pulled me out of my reflections. I opened the door to Claire, who immediately took me in her arms. Oh, Sophie, I'm so sorry for everything you've been through. But I'm so proud of you. As we settled down to talk, I realized this was the beginning of a new chapter in my life. A chapter where I would be stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever to live my life on my own terms. The battle was won, but the journey was just beginning. And for the first time in a long time, I couldn't wait to see what the future held. The weeks following Pierre's confrontation and arrest were a whirlwind of emotions and activities. I found myself immersed in a world I'd never imagined, that of legal proceedings, depositions, and preliminary hearings. The morning after Pierre's arrest, I woke up with a strange feeling. For the first time in months, I was alone in my apartment, truly alone. No Pierre plotting behind my back, no Marguerite prowling around like a vulture. Just me and the silence. I had my coffee on the balcony, watching the city wake up. The sun was rising over Paris, gilding the slate roofs, and I felt as if I were seeing the city for the first time. It was as if a veil had been lifted, allowing me to see the beauty that surrounded me. My phone rang, snapping me out of my reverie. It was Maître Dubois. "Hello, Sophie," she said in a soft but determined voice. "I hope you were able to get some rest. We have a lot of work ahead of us." She was right. The next few days were spent in endless meetings with lawyers and investigators. I had to relive every moment of the last few months, every conversation, every email discovered. It was emotionally exhausting, but I knew it was necessary. A week after Pierre's arrest, I received an unexpected call. It was Pierre's mother, my mother-in-law. "Sophie," she said in a trembling voice, I'm sorry. I didn't know how far Pierre had gone." I took a deep breath, trying to control the anger rising inside me. "Marguerite, you were an accomplice. You knew he was trying to steal my apartment." "I know," she sobbed. "I was blinded by greed. I thought this was our chance for a better life. I didn't realize Pierre was involved in illegal activities." I listened to her apology in silence, not knowing what to feel. On the one hand, I was still furious with her for her role in the whole affair. On the other, I couldn't help but feel a pang of pity for this woman who had lost everything because of her greed. "Marguerite," I finally said, "I can't forgive you, not now. But I thank you for your apology. I hope you can learn from this experience." After hanging up, I felt strangely light. I realized that I didn't need to carry the weight of their guilt. Their actions were their own, and they should bear the consequences. Weeks turned into months. Pierre's trial began, attracting media attention. I had to testify, telling our story in front of a crowded courtroom. It was a surreal experience to see my ex-husband, the man I had loved, sitting in the dock, looking dejected and aged. During his testimony, Pierre finally confessed the extent of his illegal activities. He had been involved in a vast money laundering network for years, long before our marriage. The apartment he so coveted was to be used as collateral for a large loan to cover his mounting debts. As I listened to his confession, I realized how blind I'd been. The signs were there, the mysterious phone calls, the frequent business trips, the unexplained sums of money. But love had blinded me. The verdict came after several weeks of trial. Pierre was found guilty of tax fraud, money laundering and attempted extortion. He was sentenced to 8 years imprisonment and a substantial fine. Marguerite received a 2-year suspended sentence for complicity. When the judge handed down the sentence, I felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief that justice had been done, sadness for the man I had loved, but above all, an overwhelming sense of closure. This chapter of my life was finally over. As I left the courtroom for the last time, I was mobbed by journalists. Camera flashes blinded me, and questions came from all sides. Maître Dubois guided me through the crowd, shielding me from the chaos. "No comment at this time," she repeated relentlessly. "My client asks that her privacy be respected at this difficult time." Once safely inside her car, I let out a long sigh. "It's finally over," I murmured. Maître Dubois smiled benevolently at me. "Yes, Sophie. You've been incredibly brave throughout this ordeal. Now it's time for you to think about the future." The future. The word resonated strangely in my ears. For so long, I'd been focused on survival, on the struggle. Now that it was all over, I was faced with a blank horizon, full of possibilities. The days following the end of the trial were devoted to rebuilding. I began by completely renewing my apartment, erasing all traces of Pierre's presence. Every piece of furniture moved, every wall repainted was like an act of purification, allowing me to regain possession of my space. I also decided to go back to school, something I'd given up when I got married. I enrolled in a law course, inspired by the experience I'd just had. Maybe one day I could help other women in similar situations. One evening, while working on an assignment, I got a call from Claire. "Sophie, have you seen the news?" she asked, excited. I turned on the TV to discover that Pierre's arrest had triggered a wider investigation. His money laundering network extended far beyond what we had imagined, involving high-ranking businessmen and even politicians. As I watched the footage of the other arrests, I realized the magnitude of what I had accomplished. By fighting for my apartment, I had unwittingly helped to dismantle a major criminal network. This realization gave me a new sense of purpose. I decided to use my experience to help other victims of financial fraud and abuse. I started volunteering for a victim support association, sharing my story and offering support to others going through similar ordeals. A year after the end of the trial, I received an unexpected letter. It was from Pierre, from prison. My hands trembled as I opened the envelope. "Dear Sophie," the letter said, "I know I have no right to contact you after all I've put you through. But I wanted to offer you my sincerest apologies. Prison has given me time to reflect on my actions, and I realize now how selfish and cruel I've been. You deserved so much better. I hope that one day you'll be able to forgive me, even though I know I don't deserve it. I wish you all the happiness in the world. Pierre." I read and reread the letter, not knowing what to feel. Part of me wanted to tear it up and forget about it, but another part recognized the importance of this gesture. In the end, I decided to keep it, not as a nostalgic souvenir, but as a reminder of how far I'd come. That evening, I stepped out onto my balcony, watching the city sparkle in the night. I thought about everything that had happened since that fateful day when Pierre had given me his ultimatum. I'd lost a husband, but I'd gained so much more: my freedom, my strength, and a new perspective on life. I realized that the apartment, which had been at the heart of the whole story, was just a symbol. The real treasure I had saved was myself. I had discovered a strength within myself that I never knew existed, a resilience that had enabled me to overcome betrayal and adversity. As I sipped my glass of wine, Watching the lights of the Eiffel Tower in the distance, I smiled. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, that uncertainty excited rather than frightened me. I was ready to write the next chapter of my life, on my own terms. This experience had taught me that life can be unpredictable and sometimes cruel, but also that with determination and courage, you can overcome the worst trials. I'd lost a husband, but I'd gained a new life, a new Sophie. And this new Sophie was ready to face whatever life might throw at her, with confidence and determination. The apartment was no longer just a place to live, it had become the symbol of my rebirth, my victory over adversity. Every morning, as I woke up within these walls that were truly mine, I was reminded that I was capable of overcoming anything. The future was wide open, and I couldn't wait to find out what it had in store for me.